Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannon. Debunking Atheism, Volume 4. Is God subject to time? Is there a God time? The answer to these questions is definitely no. And there's very good reason why. God cannot be subject to time and cannot have a God time of his own. And the reason is this: if God is subject to time, even his own time, then that means there's something greater than God. That is, time is greater than God because God is subject to it. Which means that God is not the supreme being because he's subject to something. And then you can ask the question, well, what created that time? What created God's time or time in general? And whatever that would be greater than God. And then, of course, you can ask, well, what created that thing? Is that thing also subject to time? And if your answer is yes, then that thing is also lesser than its own time. And then you can continue to ask the same question over and over again. Well, what created that time? Well, it was another God. Well, is that God subject to time? Yes. So, okay. So if that God is subject to time, then what created that time? And it becomes an endless question session that leads to an infinite number of beings that aren't supreme because they're all subject to time. And then ultimately, there is no supreme being, and it disproves the existence of God. This is the atheistic argument of turtles all the way down. Uh, and a theist needs to stay out of that trap of an infinite regression of gods creating other gods, because then none of them are God. The turtles all the way down argument is from a story where some explorer asked some tribal leader to explain uh, where the Earth exists, and he said that, well, the Earth is on top of the back of a turtle, and so the explorer asked him, well, what's the turtle standing on? And the leader said, he's standing on another turtle. So the explorer asked him, well, what is that turtle standing on? And the tribal leader just gave up. He said, look, it's just turtles all the way down. Well, that's an infinite regression. And atheists use that all the time as an objection to God. They'll simply say, well, who created God? Who created the God who created God? And they'll just go infinitely asking that question. And ultimately, there is no ultimate answer, so there can't be an ultimate supreme being. So you have to stay out of that turtles all the way down argument, that infinite regression argument. And the second you admit that God is subject to time or has his own time, God time, you've fallen right into that trap of the turtles all the way down argument. So definitely, God, in order to be God, cannot be subject to time. There's an additional problem, which is things that are subject to time have parts. They can move. And anything that has parts is caused by those parts, which means they can't be uncaused. They're caused by something else. So if God is subject to time, then God would have parts. And that means God would be caused by those parts, which means God could not be uncaused, which means God cannot be God. God would not be where the buck finally stops. God would have things that cause God. So that wouldn't be God. Uh, so the idea that God is subject to time or has his own God time is wrong for theists. You should never. You should always say that God is not subject to time or God is outside of time. Uh, okay. So a big atheistic objection is claiming God is subject to time or has to be subject to time. And a theist needs to explain why God is not subject to time. Now, an atheist may claim that because God, God's act of the God's volitional act of creation is a sustaining act of creation, meaning that God sustains every moment of time in the universe through his act of creation, his act to sustain that creation. That because that act occurs at every moment in time, that God is acting at every moment of time. And if that time is continuous and infinite, then God is continuously acting in time, which would mean that God himself must be subject to time because he's acting continuously, which is the same as acting in time. So, how do you get out of that argument that God's continuous act of creation does not mean necessarily that God is acting in his own time or in time itself? So, this is how you get out of that argument. God's act of creation and even his act of sustaining creation every moment of time is a timeless act. Now, you could throw your hands up in the air and say, and just walk away from the whole thing and say, well, God just, creates the universe once and then walks away from it and has nothing else to do with it. It's a set it or forget it universe. So he's not engaged in the continuous sustaining creation of the universe. You can walk away from it. But the problem is you're walking away from God because a universe that God just walks away from and does not have a continuous influence on is a universe that has its own independent existence that can sustain itself without God's assistance at all. And that means you don't need God for that universe. Well, if you don't need God for that universe, then you don't need God. So the walk away um, method of dealing with this problem doesn't work. That's ultimately an atheistic result. So, what do you do about this argument that God must have his own time because of this continuous um, volitional act of creation or sustaining the universe? Doesn't that mean that God is acting in time? Uh, and the answer is no. God's sustaining act of creation is a timeless act. Now, how is that possible? How can that be the case? Okay, how that works is this. Reality is discrete. It's not continuous. And what that means is that reality is comprised of indivisible units of space time, as opposed to a continuous space time that doesn't have indivisible units. So space time is created by indivisible units of reality or space time. Now, uh, what is this indivisible unit of space-time? Well, it's not, the tiniest little cube of space and time that you can think of. That's not what I mean by an indivisible unit of space-time. Um, it's an indivisible unit that itself doesn't have space or time or geometry for that matter. But the collection of these indivisible units of space-time are what create the greater space-time that we're aware of, that the space and time that we exist in, uh, at its most fundamental level, is a created thing, and it has an indivisible unit of reality that creates it all, as opposed to continuous. A continuous space doesn't have any indivisible unit. You can simply keep dividing it into smaller and smaller and smaller units, and it would just go on infinitely. Um, Now, at the level we're talking about of this infinite division, or where you reach a discrete unit of space-time, no microscope can show us anything at that level at this point. So, scientifically speaking, no one knows the answer to this question as to whether space-time itself is made of discrete, indivisible units of reality or not. We simply don't know the answer to that in terms of scientific proof. But there's good reason to believe that the smaller and smaller you get into space time, eventually you do reach an indivisible unit of space time. Um, One of the good reasons for believing that that is the case is Zeno's paradox of getting from point A to point B, while you first have to pass midpoint C. But there's always a midpoint between A and C, midpoint D that you first must pass through to get from A to B. And then you keep doing this between A and D. There's a midpoint E that you must first pass through. And Zeno pointed out that because there's an infinite number of midpoints, you would never be able to travel from point A to point B because you could never traverse an infinite number of midpoints. So what's the solution? Because you're obviously able to travel from A to B. How do you get out of Zeno's paradox? Well, one way you get out of it is you have an indivisible unit of space-time, so that there's a finite number of moves that you can make between point A and point B. There's only a finite number of indivisible units of space-time, and it's a finite number, so you can traverse a finite number. Some people claim that you solve Zeno's paradox through calculus and continuous motion in physics, Newtonian physics. However, that's just applying math to the problem. It's not an actual physical proof of what is actually going on between physical point A and physical point B. That's a mathematical model suggesting that it's a continuum, essentially made up of infinitesimals. But again, that's a mathematical model. No one's ever actually proven that that's actually what is occurring in reality, physical reality at the smallest levels. So there's good reason to think there is an indivisible unit of space-time. It's a weird thing. It doesn't have space or time or geometry. It's at quite possibly the Planck scale, which is 10, which is 1 meter, 1 to 10 to the negative 33 meters. I mean, you're talking small. So this is something no one's ever seen. No one has any scientific proof of what's going on at that level. But there has been a debate among philosophers since ancient classical times in Greece between those who proposed this indivisible unit, the atomists, and those who didn't, those who thought everything was continuous. And this debate is going on to this very day, even in physics, about whether reality ultimately is comprised of indivisible units of reality and has a graininess. If you get to a small enough level, you'll see this graininess, this sort of level, the Planck scale, or whether it's continuous. You just keep dividing as far as you want, and you'll never see any grains or indivisible units. All right, so the indivisible unit of space-time is what gets you out of this atheistic objection that God must be subject to time. So how's that work? Well, it works this way. What you say is that physical reality is really at the smallest scale, made up of indivisible units of space-time, and that what happens is each moment of time is the creation, disappearance or destruction, and the recreation of these indivisible units of space-time. And that series or sequence of creations and disappearances and recreations are what we experience as time itself. That's a philosophy called occasionalism. And the beauty of this explanation is that the appearance and disappearance of an indivisible unit of space-time doesn't take any time. It's a timeless act. So God could create each indivisible unit of space-time without expending any time doing so, and then having it disappear, and then having a new one created, which again doesn't take any time. And this sequence, which we experience as time, the actual creation and disappearance doesn't take time. And there is no time in between each appearance and disappearance of the indivisible unit of space-time. So there's no time expended by God in doing this, which means God's volitional act of creation or sustaining of the universe doesn't actually subject God to time at all, because these are timeless acts. However, we experience time because we experience this sequence of appearances, disappearances, and reappearances of these indivisible units of space-time. So time to us is like a film, and each moment of time is like a frame in that film. And as the film goes by, that's what time is. That's the experience of time. But each frame itself is a timeless act of creation and disappearance by God. So God himself, by creating each frame, is not subjecting himself to time. But the creation, disappearance, recreation of each frame as it goes by is what we experience as time. So we experience time, but God does not, because God is only acting in a timeless fashion in creating this film. Now, what's the connection between each frame? Since there is a disappearance of physical reality with each frame, there is no overarching reality that it's contained in. What's the connection between these frames? And the connection is that they're almost exactly identical to the previous frame, but just slightly different. And that is experienced as a continuous movie or a continuous time, just like a film. You know, the reason a film seems continuous when you see it on the big screen is because each frame is only slightly different than the previous frame. So that slight difference in each frame is what creates the connection or the continuity between each frame so that you experience the film or you experience time. So it's the same thing with time. Um, so God's act is timeless. His act of creation is timeless. He can continue to act in the universe by sustaining time while not subjecting himself to time. Um, so you don't. This is not a situation that you have to. God needs to walk away from the universe. He doesn't. He's still acting timelessly, uh, but creating time that we experience because he's creating each discrete frame, which is a timeless act. So God is not subject to time, and his creation does not subject him to time. Now, interestingly, we have from physics the wonderful photon. Now, the photon is a particle of light. However, the photon is also a timeless particle. Under the theory of general relativity, which Einstein created, the photon is considered a timeless particle, not subject to time. The photon does not experience time. Um, while it's true that a photon can appear and disappear, it can be emitted from an atom and then absorbed by an atom. No time is expended from the perspective of the photon. Now, this is a scientific um, truth based on the theory of general relativity. Now, even though a photon can appear and disappear, and you would think that that would require time, with regard to the photon, theoretically, it doesn't. So, the photon is an example of a particle of physical reality that can appear and disappear and yet is not subject to time. So, by analogy from the photon, you can understand how God could act timelessly and create time without subjecting himself to time. Because the photon, despite the fact that it can appear and disappear, does not experience time. And yet the photon can be absorbed into atoms and is a form of energy that itself can be part of matter itself, and matter is subject to time. So the photon, a timeless particle which can appear and disappear, can also be part of matter that is subject to time. So, in essence, a photon can become part of time. Einstein had his famous equation: E equals mc squared. And this means energy is equivalent to mass. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, or the speed of light times the speed of light. What this means is that mass has an enormous amount of potential energy in it. But it also means that mass and energy are equivalents. So a photon, which is a massless energy, can become part of mass or matter, which is subject to time. So a timeless particle can be subject to time. So what you have with the wonderful photon is you have something that can appear and disappear and yet never be subject to time, and yet can be part of and comprise matter, which is subject to time. So essentially, the photon is, and by analogy, physical demonstration of the very process that God uses to create physical reality without himself subjecting himself to time. So God makes an indivisible unit of space-time appear. Doesn't take any time for that to happen. It doesn't mean the thing is subject to time. And yet that thing can also create space-time if there's in collection or in mass, it can create space and time, even though itself it is not subject to space or time. It is that which creates space or time, and it is something whose appearance does not subject itself to time. It's a timeless particle, just like the photon. So the photon is physical, scientific proof of concept that God could, in fact, create physical reality through a timeless act, such as the creation and disappearance and recreation of an indivisible unit of space time, and yet not subject himself to time. And yet, this creation is responsible for the creation of space, time, and matter, and the time that we experience. So it shows the process by which an immaterial being like God could have an impact or create physical reality or a material reality through his ability to make timeless particles, or the timeless indivisible unit of space-time to appear in a timeless fashion, and how that can build into the actual space-time we experience, just like the photon can be part of actual matter, which is subject to time. So it shows that process from immateriality to materiality can occur. That process from timelessness to time can occur. And the photon is the proof of that. That's the example, the analogy by which you can show that even though God is immaterial, he can create material reality without subjecting himself to time. So, what you need to remember is God is not subject to time. God is outside of time. There are some Christians who throw in the towel when it comes to God and time, and they admit God is subject to time, or that there's a God time. That's a big mistake. Don't do that. Um, they may say that, well, yeah, God is subject to time, or God's volitional act means that God himself must be subject to time. But then that also means that the universe or the greater cosmos has to be infinitely old because God is eternal. And if God is subject to time and has always existed, then that creation, that act of creation must have always been going on, which means that the universe would have to have always existed, would have to be eternal, and that means there would have to be an infinite regress of physical reality backward in time, and that sort of explanation is wrong because things have to begin. You can't have infinite regresses. But when you start admitting that God is subject to time or has his own time, you're put in a corner where you have to admit to infinite regresses. And if you're going to admit to an infinite regress, you're in trouble because you've got, if the universe is infinitely old, or the greater cosmos is infinitely old and never had a beginning, then it's always been there. Well, then what do you need a God for? Doesn't it? Hasn't it proven it has its ability to exist independent of God? What does it need a God for? It had no beginning. God is needed to begin things. If you don't have a beginning to physical reality, as a theist, you're in big trouble in making your arguments. So, uh, so there's no need to say that God is subject to time or God has his own time. That's a big mistake. It gets you into trouble. There are theist philosophers who go down that path. I think because they throw in the towel on this particular argument about God's continuous volitional act, uh, necessarily meaning that God himself is subjecting himself to time. And that's just simply not true. There's a way out of it. It's the indivisible unit of space time and the fact that there is no time in between each discrete creation and disappearance of each unit of indivisible space time. And as I explained to you, that the photon is a perfect example by analogy of what I'm talking about and how this actually does occur in physical reality. You can ask physicists about whether the photon experiences time or not, and they'll tell you no, it doesn't under general relativity. It's a null geodesic. It is not subject to time. It does not experience time, even though it appears and disappears. That's what they'll tell you. So general relativity is a physics theory that has lasted over a century and has never been found to have a single flaw in it. True, it's not a theory of everything. It doesn't explain phenomena at the smallest quantum level. But as far as the macro world goes, its scorecard is 100% perfect. So it's a good thing to have the theory of general relativity on your side if you're a theist, and just point out the photon and the timelessness of the photon as an example of how God could act in a timeless fashion through occasionalism and not subject himself to time, and yet still not walk away from the universe and be able to intervene in the universe anytime he wants, and who is ultimately sustaining and controlling the fate of that universe at every moment of time. And that's the God we all know and love. So stick to it. There's a way to get out of these atheistic arguments. Don't throw in the towel and say God has his own time. All right. Well, I hope you learned something. This is interesting stuff. It's pretty complicated. And this kind of atheistic objection is very technical, but it's also very, very deadly if you don't know how to get out of it. And luckily for you, I just explained how to get out of it. So take care.